Yeah, good morning in Europe and Germany. Good afternoon, Asia and China. Very happy to have you here in our Sino-German webinar. As always, I'm together with my colleague here, Rüdiger von Rosen. It's my pleasure. And of course, I also welcome especially our speakers today, Dr. Schaefer, former ambassador of Germany in China, Professor Mühlhahn, president of the Zeppelin University, and Thomas Heck, partner of PwC in the United States. Rüdiger von Rosen will introduce the speakers later in more detail. Let me say some introductory words to our topic. I think we are at the right time, at the right place, to the right topic. You all know more or less we are discussing the result of the presidential election and the impact of the US-China relations. We all know the result. I have just an update here of the Financial Times. The president, Donald Trump, is close to president. In the Senate, the Republicans already have the majority. In the House of Representatives, they are close to have. So that means the most likely outcome is that we have Donald Trump again as a president, and the Republican will also have the majority in the Senate and as well as in the House of the Representatives. So that's what we call a full victory. There is less doubt about that. The question is, what does this mean for the US-China relationship? My guess would be, from a Chinese perspective, that at least Chinese leadership would be somehow more relaxed about this result than if Kamala Harris would have won the election, simply for the reason that Donald Trump, as we all know, is more interested in the leadership of the United States and in the leadership of the West. So perhaps Chinese President Xi is right. The East is on the right and the West on decline. We should discuss this. I'm interested in your opinion. Another interesting question is, of course, the question, what does it mean for the EU and especially for the EU-China policy? I remember the time for the first presidency of President Trump, and this was in the relationship between the EU and China, a very different world to what we saw in the last 4 to 5 years. Yeah, having said that, you all know I hand over to Rüdiger von Rosen. You all know the procedure. We have 3 introductory statements, and after that, you are most welcome to raise questions. So, Rüdiger, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. I will not spend too much time on introduction because all 3 are old hands for the Sino-German Center. Dr. Schaefer had spent 35 years in the German Foreign Service, out of which 7 years was to be German ambassador in Beijing. So, Dr. Schaefer, please start. And I do not know really who will be relaxed in these days. I'm definitely not.
Well, I'm definitely also not. Thank you very much for the introduction. I think many of us have had a short night and are a bit exhausted. But the result that we are looking at, in my view, can even be called a landslide victory for Trump. Not only has he won, with all certainty, the presidential elections, but the Republicans have also regained the Senate. If the GOP can hold on to the House, Trump will have enormous leverage to push his MAGA agenda without major resistance. Trump, a few minutes ago, in his acceptance speech this morning, said, "We now have a mandate." How will this shape the Sino-American relations? It's of course not possible to make clear predictions, but a look into the China-related statements during the campaign allows to identify a number of trends. And I would like to share a few thoughts with you on 5 key issues. 1, China, being the ideological foe, is a bipartisan consensus. For Republicans and Democrats alike, China poses the greatest geopolitical and geo-economic challenge of the century. The Middle Kingdom threatens, from their point of view, American hegemony in the Pacific and globally. Rhetorically, Trump has been far more radical than Harris, calling China a totalitarian foe who is aiming at the destruction of the American way of life. And I think this threat should be taken seriously. Obama 10 years ago has declared Washington's pivot to Asia. With Trump, we will see an even more forceful concentration on East Asia. This is a dramatic development because Trump's East Asia policies will have serious consequences for us in Europe. Second, America first. American economic interests will have absolute priority. Trump will enter his second term of office totally different than in 2016. An army of about 40,000 hand-picked persons are ready to help him implement his MAGA objectives, starting with day one. Domestically, I think he intends nothing less than to abolish the public service as we know it. A key will be control of the justice system. Top priority of his foreign policy will be American economic interests. He will use all leverage available, including political pressure and blackmail, to reach his objectives. One result will be far more trade conflicts than before, as Trump refuses any form of fair balance of interests. Trump 1 has demonstrated that he is not at all interested in a rules-based international order. A self-declared deal-maker, as he calls him, he believes that multilateral cooperation is a waste of time and contrary to American interests. For him, the issue is power. His negotiation position is stronger if he can enforce American interests bilaterally rather than seeking compromise in a multilateral framework. In this respect, Trump, I would say, is not so unsimilar to Beijing, where China first has also highest priority. The only difference is that Beijing thinks much more strategic. A key issue of the Sino-American trade conflict will be, not surprisingly, the World Trade Organization. Trump has identified the WTO as directed against American interests since a long time. He will intensify the process of weakening the organization, which has already been started by Obama and continued by Biden. For Beijing, this, I think, is a massive problem. No economy has profited more from the WTO than China, except maybe Germany. At first sight, this seems to be a certain contradiction to the widely shared assumption that China intends to replace the existing rules-based order by a new order designed by Beijing. I share this opinion, but only in part. The Chinese are fed up to be patronized by the US and the West, as are all BRICS and all important countries of the global South. They want to see their interests taken on board and have an active say in the shaping of the international order, which is going through a historic transformation. But they're not unrealistic. They know that this cannot work out without Western economies. By the way, this issue, the readjustment of the international order, to me, has been the most striking difference between Harris and Trump as far as foreign policy is concerned. My third point, Taiwan will be a litmus test for Sino-American relations. I cannot, at the short time available, address the security-related challenges which Europe will have to face with Trump. They will be dramatic, in particular regarding Ukraine. But this issue is, of course, of highest relevance also to China. For Beijing, Taiwan represents a vital interest, the very core of its one China policy. An active American support for Taiwan's independence is for Beijing the red line. Washington's position regarding Taipei is therefore the crucial issue in their bilateral relations. Some members of the foreign policy community in Beijing are looking rather positively at a second Trump term, as they expect him to allocate little or no resources in the issue of Taiwanese sovereignty or its moral support. And one must say, at the outset of his first term of office, Trump enjoyed a certain popularity in Taipei because of his firm stance on China. That popularity has diminished significantly when he started to suggest that Taipei should pay for the US for its military protection. In the local press in Taipei these days, he is even called a mafioso collecting protection money. Harris, on the other hand, was expected to continue, grosso modo, Biden's Taiwan policy of strategic ambivalence, which, of course, was watered down lately as well. So I personally believe that there is a stark difference in rhetoric between Trump and Harris, but that their policies in practice don't differ significantly as far as Taiwan is concerned. The main reason, of course, is that Taiwan is and will remain an important high-tech partner to the US, and that in terms of security, the existing Taiwan Relations Act cannot be derogated easily by any president. But it's relatively clear that Trump does not want to have a big conflict with China, but it's rather looking to come out of this conflict with a big chunk of economic deal. My fourth point, very short, values would have been a priority for Harris. They are secondary for Trump. The fate of the Uyghurs or critics of the communist regime in Beijing will have no priority whatsoever for Trump. He has nil interest in human rights or other international legal standards. Legitimate is for him what serves American and his personal interest. This is well reflected in his recent campaign statement that China could do with Hong Kong whatever it wanted. I mean, one has to, so to say, reflect this statement. My fifth and last point, Beijing is very ambivalent looking forward to a second Trump term. We here in Europe perceive the US election as decisive for the direction of the ongoing global transition. Beijing is looking at this very differently. During the last couple of days, I had the opportunity to talk to a former Chinese minister, as well as to the present deputy ambassador of China in Berlin. Both have highlighted to me the difficulties of the Chinese political establishment to determine differences between the two candidates as far as China is concerned. Biden's China policy has already, of course, been perceived as being aggressive. Example, the famous CHIPS Act. Most Chinese believe that this would not change with Harris. Now, Trump, on the other hand, is expected to be less predictable, but most experts see a far-reaching strategic consistency with the main objective to contain the economic rise of China. But let me look a bit more into the various Chinese bubbles. There are two distinctive schools of thought. Economic experts put priority to the effects of the intended rise of import tariffs on all Chinese goods, expected up to 60%. That, of course, would result in a significant burden of the economy, as the Chinese dependency on the American market is still considerable. These experts predict a significant rise in trade conflicts. Despite sanctions of the Biden administration, like the CHIPS Act, there have been countless bilateral negotiations between Washington and Beijing, with both sides trying to avoid or at least minimize conflicts. With Trump, that is expected to change. Very different from is the thinking of the foreign policy community in Beijing. They have been increasingly irritated by Biden's efforts to forge new alliances with China's neighbors, including South Korea, Japan, India, Philippines, and in particular Taiwan. These people take it that this policy would have been continued with Harris. Trump, on the other hand, is expected to have less interest in such alliances, and in particular, as I already explained, no vested interest to defend Taiwan. That is seen as a potential advantage in these circles. All in all, the Chinese political elite, I think, is preparing since a long time for a next phase in their bilateral relations with the US, which will be significantly thornier than in the past. My last remark, that will put us in Europe into an enormous dilemma. Trump's policies will force us more than ever to identify and defend our European interests ourselves, at least as far as possible. That will immediately create the difficult question how to position ourselves in cases when our interests are fundamentally different from the American ones. Are we ready to define our relationship with China differently than Washington is expecting us to do? The new administration in Washington will create massive challenges for us in Europe, not only in terms of security policy, but also as a consequence of the Sino-American trade conflict. It is possible that China will be the issue which will most divide America and Europe. So much my initial remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. We are moving into Frosty Times, everyone knows. There are many, many questions, but we will move on to New York. Thomas Heck, partner of Pricewaterhouse and German Foreign Business Network leader there, organizing roundtables for German American CFOs, etc. Well, and for many, many years, for 12 years, more or less, had the China desk for China, the China desk for PwC. So we are looking forward to have your remarks as well. Go ahead, please, Thomas.
Thank you, Rüdiger from Rosen. And actually, I'm in Munich today. We have our German partners meeting tomorrow. So I'm here in Bavaria. I'm looking at the election from afar. My wife called me at 3 a.m. and said there's honking outside in New York on the street. And even that tells you that even in a liberal city as New York City, people are celebrating Trump's victory. Yeah, let me give some remarks about this. So the US election took place in an operational landscape that is designed and reflected by high geopolitical volatility and uncertainty. We identify 9 forces that will continue the uncertain environment and influence the conditions of how business will operate under. We believe that these forces will continue to influence the operating environment for the next decade. Number 1 is protectionism, supply chain world, labor, US-China rivalry, the tech disruption, inequality, distrust, shifting global powers, and polarization. Protectionism will likely drive the policy-making of the new administration. While specific policy details may shift, Washington will almost certainly expand protectionism over US critical supply chains, critical technology, critical infrastructure, and selective sensitive data. Examples are the inbound investment screening. After clarifying its compliance guidance, CFIUS increased its penalty applications and signaled stricter enforcement to come. In 2024, CFIUS issued 3 fines reaching up to 60 million per transaction. CFIUS authority will likely grow as the Department of Treasury raises penalty limits and tightens investment controls. We also have outbound US investment screening. The Treasury Department issued final rules for implementing the outbound screening mechanisms mandated by a Biden executive order. This rule could still be updated, but it's slated to go into effect in early 2025. Also, supply chain visibility. The Department of Commerce launched a supply chain risk assessment tool that could formalize the previously quiet campaign by top US officials that urge MNCs to reconsider their investments in China. The Commerce Department will also likely intensify scrutiny over supply chains outside of China if they rely on Chinese-made components. National security continues to drive US policymaking. We expect the US national security focus to intensify in 2025 and beyond, with or without the support of US allies. Washington continues to use what we call a 2-pronged national security approach. Almost 2 years ago, the US government announced a strategic shift in its trade paradigm to prioritize national security over the financial prosperity of US business, and effectively told the business community to get on board with that shift. So what is this 2-pronged approach? We call it carrots and sticks. Carrots, these are the incentives for domestic investments in strategic sectors such as electric mobility, alternative energy, etc. Sticks are the protectionist trade and investment policies that the US administrations, Trump administration and Biden administration have implemented. In 2024, Washington continued to unleash funds, carrots, from incentive programs previously enacted by Congress. They expanded or employed numerous protectionist policies, including more tariffs on Chinese semiconductors, batteries, steel, critical minerals, and electric vehicles, a continued push for G7 and US allies and partners to coordinate against the threat from China and Russia. Washington will almost certainly continue to expand regulatory protectionism over US supply chains, critical technology, infrastructure, and selective sensitive data. The government is working to enhance inbound investment controls and outbound investment controls, restrict selective data transfer supply chains. Businesses have to evaluate their supply chains and partnership and data management practices as they adapt to the evolving regulatory landscape. Harris and Trump have both made it clear that US pressure on China will continue, no matter who wins. Both are determined to de-risk the US from China by home-shoring or near-shoring to critical supply chains. In my remarks that I prepared for this, obviously I compared Harris to Trump, and I would like to still give those remarks because I think both probably policies, choices will impact the future. So Vice President Harris will likely aim to manage the tensions with China via enhanced diplomacy and communication. without letting up on the existing protectionist policies to mitigate risk in the critical sectors. This would extend the Biden-Harris administration's approach. If Harris was win, our prediction was that she maintains active back-channel communication with Beijing. She would strengthen alliances in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China's growing influence and continue strategic collaboration with allies to address challenges, such as forced technology transfers or intellectual property theft. She would continue to target efforts to de-risk the US from China in critical sectors from domestic industrial policies. Trump, on the other side, our prediction was that he will revisit his past policies and expand them into his expand his first-term efforts. In its first term, the Trump administration challenged conventional US government approaches to China by implementing tariffs and seeking to limit Chinese threats to US infrastructure and investments in the US. While the Biden administration retained much of this approach, the Trump administration would likely advance similar policy more unilaterally with broad application. In the second term, the Trump administration would likely expand the amount and scope of tariffs against China, close loopholes in trade relationships that allow Chinese companies to bypass tariffs and restrictions, continue efforts to enhance US national security by banning inbound and outbound investments to and from China. So what are the key takeaways? Both Harris and Trump view China as a strategic competitor and potential adversary. We expect both would continue prioritizing policies that limit China's threats to US business, supply chains, and national security. Chinese retaliation could create additional risk for MNCs. MNCs should expect pressure from the US government on their operations in China, leading to a greater need for strategic updates and supply chain diversifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas Heck. We move immediately over to Professor Mühlhahn. He is president of the private Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen and served for more than 20 years in different positions in Turku, in Bloomington, and in Berlin as professor for Chinese history and culture. So we get the academic view now from your side. Professor Mühlhahn, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. von Rosen. Pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about this topic. So indeed, I have spent as much time in China as in the United States, actually, having worked in both places and have had many discussions. And what I would like to do is I would like to offer a little bit of a different perspective, perhaps also, I mean, I do understand that we are under shock, but still have a little bit more of an upbeat perspective. And that is not that I'm a big fan of what's happening in the United States, but it's just a reality that we have to live with. And once we sort of overcome the shock, there's still work to do. And I think there is still the necessity now, actually, more than ever, because as Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Heck has, of course, completely correctly pointed out, there will be a really unruly, rocky world that's coming toward us, but we still need to find ways to keep the channels open and lead the dialogue. So I would like to make, I think, 4 points. And the first is, it's clearly, and I won't repeat what Mr. Heck and Mr. Schaefer has said, there is policy changes coming, and we have heard them. But I would like to say that most of my Chinese counterparts that I have been, reading in the last couple of days, also academics mostly, emphasize, of course, that there's one big advantage that Trump has over Harris, that he is less ideological. While he might be completely convinced that there's a strategic competition with China underway that the US needs to win, many of my Chinese counterparts still believe that Trump is more pragmatic, less ideological, more open to negotiations, even if it's unclear what the negotiations will produce. But it's at least somebody that some people in China think will continue to talk and there will be chances to negotiate. And also in a very limited way to have a cooperation. So when it comes to economic and trade cooperation, again, many of the Chinese academics have emphasized that Trump is known for, emphasizing specific results over ideology, and therefore that they also see a window of opportunity talking with the Trump administration, especially when it comes to investing into manufacturing. Many Chinese businesses believe that there is a chance once they, sort of talk to the administration, make clear that they would be willing to invest in the United States, that there also may incentives for Chinese companies to set up factories in the US or in Mexico or in other places that are considered sort of third-party countries. Finally, my third point here is geopolitical dynamics. And again, we have heard, and it is correct, I agree, China, of course, Trump undermines and rejects the values and the rule-based order. He attacks probably, which is the constitutional order in the US. I mean, there has been immense changes in the thinking about the power of the presidency in the United States, which is now basically unlimited. So there's a bigger difference, if you come to that, to the position of Xi Jinping. But again, I would say that many Chinese academics actually point out that Trump is less likely to lead wars. It was one of the big slogans of his campaign to stop the never-ending wars. They believe that he is less likely to actually get into wars. They hope that a solution to the Ukraine conflict is probably more likely or more possible under Trump, who will probably force Ukraine to make concessions that cannot be expected from the current administration. And for China, for Taiwan, the Taiwan issue, I think also depends on how you read it, but there's also possibility at least that he is more pragmatic, again, less ideological driven, has an interest in the continuation of the status quo, which would align very well with China. Then also Chinese academics emphasize that there are still opportunities for cooperation. There are efforts or there are topics that they hope they can talk to about with the Trump administrations. And of course, that also includes things like digital platforms, access, and so on and so forth, where they hope that there could be some movement with the Trump presidency. And then I'd be very short. I have a conclusion to make. So this is not to say that we do not face a changed world, obviously. And if you look at it, however, well, I think also European commentary focuses on American exceptionalism, or we have to see that what happens in the United States now is according to my understanding, really part of a worldwide, a global movement that has led to the rise of nationalist, protectionist, and anti-migrant parties and movements all over the world. In Europe, we know that very well. Just think about the latest German elections. We see it in other parts of the world, including India. I would even say we see it also in China, where under Xi Jinping, the government has adopted a much more nationalist, much more protectionist, much more anti-migrant is not an issue here, but let's say a xenophobic, or at least a certain skepticism toward outside influence, whether it's people or it's culture and so on. So that is certainly the case. So the world, the structures, the international institutions are in danger. And that's, I think, not a question, but that makes it ever more important that despite the difficulties, we emphasize the interconnectedness of the countries, including Europe. And we have to do everything now more important than ever to steer the relationship toward pragmatism, avoid escalation through cooperation, and therefore hope or try to build constructive engagement. We cannot simply accept the fate of a polarized world where this is not possible, but we have to highlight the constructive efforts that can benefit all nations and the global community. So I think that would be my 2 cents. Thank you very much.